So Nik Forrest is an interdisciplinary artist based in Tio'tia, aka Montreal. They're currently working on a PhD at Concordia University in the interdisciplinary humanities program. Their practice includes experimental sound performance, installation, and composition, as well as experimental video and video installation. Their recent projects explore the ecological potentials of sound and listening as techniques to heighten attunement to entangled human and non-human materials, bodies, and forces, and to the interconnected affective, social, and environmental relations. Okay, so thank you. And then I'll do Kate's and then hand it off. Kate Paxman is an artist, educator, and practice-led PhD researcher in media arts with the School of Art, Design, and Architecture at Plymouth University. Kate works with film, sound, animation, and drawing, building speculative narratives, which explore our era of unavoidable climate catastrophe, and has received a number of Arts Council awards for her work. Kate's research is focused on sea caves on the shore area of Torbay's Marine Conservation Zone, where she pays close attention to geologies and entities and different timescales and how they can help us address the shift towards more inhospitable futures. So I'd like to welcome both of you. And Nik, if you'd like to go ahead and give your synopsis of your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, and thanks everyone. Thanks for being here. As Flounder was saying, I'm an artist and PhD student based in Tio'tia, Montreal. And I think it's important to just acknowledge that this is an island that's recognized as unceded indigenous land and the traditional territory of the Kanyankehage. This island has long served as a meeting place for many different indigenous and other nations, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabeg. And I'm like a white European settler from Scotland. I came here when I came to Canada, or what's now called Canada, when I was 12. And also, as a non-binary person and an artist working with sound, I'm really thinking about how to listen and work here as a guest with a kind of care and curiosity, and also with an awareness of the traditions and histories of the indigenous people associated with this area, but also especially with a recognition of the ongoing presence and vital knowledges of indigenous activists, scholars, and artists, especially around ecological questions and the rich long-term understanding of entangled kinship relations with the more than human. And so those knowledges have really informed my thinking about sound as a non-human material force, and as about listening as a way to reorient a sensory connection with each other and with our surroundings. My PhD work works across sound studies, gender studies, and studio art practice that's centered on sound installation, performance, and shared listening. And I'm exploring these practices looking for ways that they can make palpable and perceptible environments and bodies as entangled, co-emergent, forming, unforming materialities. And through this work, I'm asking, how can co-creation, co-composition, and listening with the non-human, as well as listening beyond usual sensory limits or outside of normative registers, heighten attunement to our surroundings and the other humans and non-humans in it. And I think sounds, there are particular things about sound that really lend it as a medium for this research, including its animate, relational, indeterminate, and emergent characteristics, and the way that it challenges normative boundaries and understandings of nature and culture, technology, biology, form, formlessness, and even material and immaterial. And I think that these qualities and these actions, and I guess these agencies, make it a medium and practice especially well suited to rethinking and reimagining questions of non-conforming embodiment and subjectivity, as well as social and ecological relations more generally. So how can encounters with sound and with shared or collective listening reshape, transfigure, and transform us and our relations with a world in transition? One of the ways I've been exploring these ideas is through sound derived from very low frequency or VLF signals. So VLF carrier waves, which are electromagnetic rather than audio waves. So they're similar in a way to FM radio signals, but just oscillating at a much lower frequency. To hear these sounds, you need an antenna receiver that gathers and filters the signal, plus an amplifier and speakers or headphones. And obviously they can be recorded. So these signals originate in weather and atmospheric phenomena like lightning, solar flares, aurora borealis, so terrestrial and space weather phenomena, as well as the urban electrical grids, power lines, transformers, architectural wiring, and array of electronic and digital devices. So for me, that's very interesting because these sounds that derived from these signals really cross over any absolute lines we would like to draw between nature and culture or natural and man-made. So for me, listening and working with VLF signals, which are sometimes called natural radio, is partly a way to attune to the normally imperceptible and unfamiliar registers of non-human cosmic and atmospheric transmissions, a way of tuning in to non-human media. And as cities and their infrastructures become more dense, and as climate changes and weather events intensify, VLF signals are also effective. So listening with VLF is partly a way to attune to these changes and to reorient relations with our surroundings to what we understand as knowable, sensible, and possible. And I would leave it there for now.
That's wonderful.
Okay.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll follow Nick and give my short presentation. And the title of my talk, or the title of my presentation was Sirens, Crossing Thresholds of Multi-Entity Ethics. And in it, I describe how in early autumn 2019, I invited a group of artists, academics and researchers to swim with me into a series of caves at Livermead in the Torbay Marine Conservation Zone, which is in the southwest of UK. Sirens is the working title for a new moving image installation and sound composition which is made with the field recordings from those journeys into the caves. And in my video presentation for this symposium, I talk about my research for this work. These watery trips are intended as journeys towards prioritising the imagination and challenging the hierarchical and exceptionalist thinking aligned to Western Enlightenment through experimental ways of data gathering and expanded notions of field research. This challenge aligns with my thesis, which asks what arts practice can do when it is so tangled up in the complexities of our long and continuing dependence on extraction, exploitation of both human and non-human, and consumption, which have become a transformative force on our ecologies. My fieldwork involves multiple and varied trips to gather field data from these local littoral zone marine caves. And there is an ethics in my choice of this location, as it is possible for me to access this nearby place repeatedly, to look and look again, my frequent visits generating a study of long duration. I'm also interested in the many layers of coexisting pressures at this urban marine edgeland, defined by its geography and geology, which make it sheltered and useful for centuries of human occupation and coastal practices. In this familiar, densely populated location, I'm framing the urgency of recognizing the force of human-driven global transformations in the very local in order to open up what feminist post-humanist theorists Cecilia Usber and Marietta Radomska refer to as a space for situated, multi-directional and practice-based processes of knowledge production. The caves in Torbay's Marine Conservation Zone were formed by the surge and scour action of the waves, but rising sea levels causing more frequent extreme weather events mean these dynamic environments are now facing accelerated risk of complete destruction from the processes which created them. Many of the caves have Joint Nature Conservation Committee vulnerability assessments, which are assessments of the possible impacts on habitats and species from human activities. And the vulnerability of these sites makes me uncomfortably aware of the problem of being the problem. My discomfort arises from privileging my observations and entering where all more than human, plants, animals and things are made vulnerable by my actions. My processes of observation in these fragile sites allow me to reveal the dilemmas inherent in my actions and to acknowledge that I am part of the complex relations in these entanglements. So when we swam across the threshold of the first chamber, we felt conditions change. Conditions particular to cave threshold environments provide a niche for assemblages of organisms where they will be protected from the harsh rays of the sun and the extremes of drought and changes in atmospheric temperature. In conversation about cave biology, geologist Dr. Chris Proctor explained to me that ecological transitions or zonations within sea caves are substantially more varied and complex than those typical of inland caves. And these patterns of biological zonation often contain communities of maritime and non-marine fauna living in close proximity. A sea cave threshold is an environment where inhabitants find comfort and refuge, an ecological niche within narrow margins and especially vulnerable to increasing dynamics of systems change. Swimming into watery realms, we can think in more inclusive models of imagination and approach what Haraway calls our responsibility. In my practice research and my practice as an artist, I intend to think with as a means of attempting to alter the way we understand the places we occupy, inhabit, and exploit in an everyday way. In the porous, diverse tidal habitat of Torbay's Marine Conservation Zone, in the undersides and the openings beneath dense urban occupation, I think with and think what can be unlearned by imaginatively engaging with the environment of cave threshold.
Great, thank you both for your synopsis. I feel like I understand a lot more constantly. But I'm going to see if you have questions for each other first before bringing in any other comments. So either one of you want to start?
Yeah. So, I mean, Nick, shall I start? Because
Yeah, would you mind?
not at all. I have a lot of questions, and I think the first thing is more a kind of a comment than a question, and it's just that it seems to me that your research and your thinking about sensing differently that comes with what you like really poetically call transitions, radical alterations, and the extended listening with the VLF signals that you're working with. These are essentially vital and useful positions for, I suppose, what we could call the uncertain futures we are facing. So it's a comment, but I wonder if you would also like to just speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I guess especially over the last years, I've become really interested in, what are the potentials offered by, I mean, in a way, the kind of research that both of us are doing, that foregrounds a kind of embodied sensory research and can include imagination. And what can that offer us that perhaps other ways of trying to kind of measure, name, assess, and categorize everything, the world around us, the natural world, the human world, everything, hasn't really worked so well. So I guess there's something that I've been wondering about in terms of how really orienting this embodied sensing that perhaps always has to renew itself, what that can offer us in terms of understanding where we are and where we might be going. So I don't know if that makes sense as an answer.
Yeah, that really does. And I think it brings in some of the crossing points that I really felt that we were speaking to in both of our ways of describing our research and our presentations. And I'd just like to follow that with a second question, if that's okay. But and it's just what we have. I just wanted to say that I really love your term tremble. And we were speaking about this together, but I just love your term tremble, and you use it in the context of our encounters with sound and with each other and with entities. And I think I mentioned that it made me think of Deborah Bird Rose and her term shimmer. And she's also talking about a commitment to bear witness to the shimmering and lively, powerful, interactive worlds that ride the waves of ancestral power. So she's also talking about Indigenous knowledge practices and working with. And so I wonder if you could speak more about how you came to your expression tremble and its wider implications for you.
Yeah. Well, in a certain way, I'm coming to that through thinking about what sound actually does in contact with materials, including with bodies and environments and other materials, and sort of its vibratory force and its potential to be unsettling in a way, or like sometimes disruptive, but certainly challenging the notion of like fixed form and fixed borders. And I've come across the term tremble in a number of places where people are referring to Edouard Glissant. And one of the places that I came across that was in the writing of Paul Preciado, a trans theorist and curator. He talks about, Glissant talks about like a trembling of thought or trembling thinking. And what he's implying by that is like a trembling of knowledge structures. And so I really was thinking about these two kind of vibratory potentials, like vibrating materials and sort of even the kind of transduction of idea and or sense among bodies and among materials. But at the same time, a kind of trembling of knowledge structures and of kind of these absolute ways we've been understanding the natural world, the human world, and relations between us. So I just think there's a lot of potential in thinking of this sort of disruptive, vibratory potential.
Yeah, you spoke as well about unsettling the sensory, which I think is a wonderful term that you use, and you also spoke about these binaries and that sound is material and immaterial, and it's an amorphous thing. It's not something that can be like categorized and classed and contained, and so I think that is this sound, this term tremble is a really useful, is a really poetic way of evoking those notions in your work, and you use a lot of language in your work that relates to sound as well, which I really enjoy. So you speak about Eva Hayward's writing, and about Eva Hayward writes about transness, and you use words like vibratory and resonant and improvised and co-composition, and it just, I think this, along with these word tremble, brings a lot of richness to kind of encountering your presentation and encountering your research, and encountering your ideas about unsettling the sensory. I think that language helps me, that foregrounding of language around sound and language around the sonic rather than language around the visual, as metaphor or description. I think that really helps reposition me when I'm encountering your research.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about how to, I feel like I'm an artist. My background is in art practice. I don't have an academic background, so, but now I'm kind of engaged in this interdisciplinary humanities PhD that involves a lot of writing. And so I've been thinking about how to mobilize writing for myself in a way that I can kind of feel what I'm trying to do with it. And one of the places that I've really that really kind of triggered some kind of rethinking about the kind of language to use when talking about sound is from reading Salome Vogelin,
Yeah.
who talks about a sonic sensibility and a sonic sensibility that she brings to writing. And I thought that's really interesting because, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of kind of discussion all over the place about how the visual dominates Western culture, Western thinking, Western thought, and that part of that involves a certain kind of capture and fixing. And I mean, trying to think and write sonically, maybe in partly is a kind of resistance to that. But also I think of it as just a reorientation, especially if you bring a kind of sonic sensibility to the visual and to the other senses and to touch and to haptic senses and to, yeah, I guess just encounters with things. Yeah, so it's that's maybe one thing I would say about that, and also the for me, when I started to really kind of experiment with sound, so in installation forms and in performance, and sort of understand the way that it has material, like evident material effects in the world, the way that it moves things and shifts things, then it really started to make sense to me to really think in terms of these kind of metaphors that are actually more than metaphors, because they're sort of descriptions of what sound is already doing, So it's more like me catching up with what this non-human force is already up to, and just finding ways to follow it and finding ways to kind of engage through language with what's already happening, regardless of what I'm doing. So, I mean, yeah, I could ramble on, but I'm wondering if I guess I'm also wondering, in your work, one thing, in a similar way, that you're really centering this embodied sensory research, where you're actually, physically going to this place and going again to this place. So it's also a durational engagement with a particular place, and also a shared engagement where you're going as a group to this place. I think there's something really interesting about that, where there's a shared intention, and then you're actually experiencing something together, and there must be something that passes between you, in addition to the discussion I'm sure you have. But I'm sort of interested in the kind of, I guess, transduction of experience, or something that may be happening amongst bodies and amongst human and non-human bodies and materials when you're together in these locations. And that's something that I kind of felt in seeing the images, and it made me want to go there.
Yeah, I think some of the things that you've been just speaking about disrupting kind of normative ideas of sensing, or unsettling the normal ideas of sensing. And I think that, so for me, what I do is so embedded in field research, or what I term kind of field research, which is pretty expanded. And then much of my practice revolves around field trips, so sort of collective field trips, that like a performative field trip event. And for the swimming, it came about, and I didn't try to orchestrate, I didn't try to choreograph, I just allowed the experience to come about. And I think that so the whole thing of it was that, so there wasn't a lot of dialogue surrounding it. There was expression of intentions, and there was interest in my research, but actual in terms of instruction, or it's sharing of critical thinking or critical ideas. There was nothing of that, but just a shared journey, and then a moment of going into quietness when we got changed. I mean, and that's a really big thing. It's like we were actually embarking on this research field trip, but in a different environment. I mean, we had to leave our land identities behind, or our land kind of costumes behind, and sort of put on our costumes for the water, which was, in my case, a very thick wetsuit. And then entering the water together. And again, during the trip, my kind of thinking and writing about that particular field trip and what happened, and that connection, and that connectivity, and that shared sensing has all been things that I've thought about post, since in the studio, or when I've been thinking about the film, or thinking about the transcripts of conversations afterwards. But after the trip, we all spoke about the kind of collected kind of thing that we were all doing with each other. And in the water, you could feel that we weren't pursuing individual paths. We were all kind of collectively working together. So and I think that it was an interesting way of making work, and an interesting way of conducting this kind of amalgam of research and field work and performance and performativity, all in a collected way. And again, I come back to the kind of language and the terms that you use, but this like how sensing differently, or how for me, I attempt to approach kind of like the sensoria of others and the sensibilities of the other or other, um, uh, and yeah. So I sort of come back to that in terms of what we attempted and what we felt when we were on the trip together. So yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting to think about
how about last?
like the water, as a milieu, I guess, that that kind of necessarily dishabituates your sensing. So I guess you would see and hear, but also haptically feel your body completely differently in this milieu. And I think it's very interesting to think about, yeah, like milieu and techniques that could work together to kind of estrange ourselves from our habitual sensing, and what that can offer for kind of re-sensing or reattuning or kind of newly encountering our surroundings, whatever they are, kind of on new terms. I don't know if that makes sense, but I mean, part of my thinking has really been informed by Dylan Robinson, who I talk about a little bit in the video, and his brilliant book Hungry Listening, that kind of talks about the colonial structures that have kind of really limited and held listening in particular, but all sensing in particular forms. And so what can you do if you want to unsettle that and reattune in other ways that kind of don't involve those forms of sort of judgment and limit and value, right? And aren't based on the kind of values of extraction, right? So there's something that I hear and kind of feel in your video that's not extractive. It is really more about an encounter among these people and in this and kind of with this place. And I think that's something that I'm really thinking about. How do you, and I don't have an answer, right? Because in a way, every recording is an extraction of something. But so how do you, I'm thinking about how do you listen with and kind of be with environments and others in ways that might come from, like not knowing in advance what's going to be important or valuable. You know what I mean? Trying to kind of just be there and see what happens and catch up with what is happening.
Yeah, and I think that's how I was trying to describe what we embarked on in that kind of performative trip, is that there was no kind of tight preparation and but to just encounter what's there when we're there. And I just in context of what you're speaking about with Dylan Robinson and sound and listening, and you say you describe listening with uncertainty and affective and non-semantic approaches to sound. Is that part of your strategy, or just what if you could just kind of describe a little bit about what you are what you're meaning when you say affective and non-semantic approaches to sound.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that I'm thinking about there is it's very interesting when you're listening to languages that you don't understand or that you partly understand. So it's been interesting living in Montreal over the years and becoming better at French. I've kind of experienced this shift from like a language that's like pure sound to a language that has more and more semantic meaning. But it, for me, it still has both. Like English is pretty much just I'm listening, almost entirely for for meaning, for communication in terms of semantic meaning. I mean, sometimes I try to play with that, and I think one of the things we talked a little bit about is deep listening, and I've been looking into the deep listening practices proposed by Pauline Oliveros, and she has some beautiful sonic meditations that are about, listening to a word until you don't understand it anymore, and like sounding words like deliberately in very, very, very long ways until they kind of lose that semantic meaning, and actually kind of take on more of a, kind of like a timbral or affective presence, I guess. But also, like, Dylan Robinson uses like at least a couple of different Indigenous languages in his book. And he also has a section where he says, okay, settlers, stop reading here. This bit's not for you. And I think that's an amazing, really interesting, so what is it to not be able to understand everything and not be able to capture everything and know everything and like own it, so I find that very, I'm still thinking about it, but I'm wondering if there's actually very, very, there's something very interesting and maybe productive about listening in other ways that are really about not knowing, about being uncertain about what things are, and encountering them like kind of on their terms rather than my terms as a human, which might traditionally have been to name, categorize, and place in a hierarchy. So
yeah, and I think this is what we spoke as well about. I think this is a lot about what Catherine Yusuf is saying in her essay about the insensible, or sensing the insensible, about that there are things that we can't categorize because she calls, she's locating the insensible in kind of a multitude of biotic subjects, but I think it expands beyond that. I mean, for me, it's the usefulness in Yusuf's term of the insensible expands beyond that. And I think that Yusuf's talking about if we are going to create, like, I'll quote it, but if we are going to create new practices of sensations and new sensibilities, we need to understand that the way we sense is entrenched in habit. We've got habitual ways of thinking and understanding, which is this kind of Western coded way of categorizing and listing and thinking. But there are many, many things which are beyond our understanding that we can't categorize in those ways, or we can't approach in those ways. And I think how do we approach the things that we don't know, and how do we acknowledge the insensible, and shift our imaginations to encounter other imaginaries and encounter other ontologies and other ways of being, and other ways of sensing that are not kind of human centered or human first, or in a multitude of what that means when I say human, or what that means when I say we. It's not a hierarchical proposition. It's of many different ways of being, and of many different ways of inclusivity. So yeah.
yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think about too is that when you're listening, you're never the only listener. If you start to kind of understand that what you're hearing in any particular place has been kind of attenuated by all of the materials and bodies that are there, right? So in a way, I might think that, I'm hearing something, but in fact, there's this very complicated, entangled relational listening and sounding going on all the time. And, it's like you say, it's just a habit of sensing to think that I'm at the center of that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. This has been amazing so far, and you've made my job as moderator so far effortless. It's amazing. I do have a question for both of you, and then I will also open it up for questions from the audience. And I think this relates in some ways to trembling that you mentioned, and also Laura commented on in the chat. That I think you were both dealing with waves and their interactions with solid objects and people. In classical physics, diffraction is when waves encounter obstacles or openings or even their own reflections. And Meeting the Universe Halfway, Barad says, quote, "We can understand diffraction patterns as patterns of difference that make a difference, to be the fundamental constituents that make up the world," end quote. So how do you think diffraction and or reflection play into your practice research for both of you?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure how to answer it, but it's interesting to think about the way Barad talks about matter, and like when you say solid objects, I mean, there's kind of a question there, and I mean, part of what I think she's saying is that a lot of what we experience of matter is actually space, and is actually process, right? Is actually change. So that's something that really captures my attention, because it sort of suggests that actually our habit of understanding and experiencing the world as solid is actually challenged at a really, really fundamental level that actually seems to be more about a process of forming and unforming. That doesn't really say anything about diffraction, but maybe what I would say is like in sort of diffraction is usually something that's applied to light, I guess, right? But I guess maybe sound too. But one of the ways that I've been thinking is really in terms of transduction. So the way that sound sort of energy can transfer among materials and bodies. Yeah, and I guess like it's similar to what to what Kate and I were just talking about. I mean, one of the great sort of potentials I see there is that whether we realize it or not, we're already hearing not just a sound, but everything that sound has touched before it touches us, right? So you can think of like, I'm hearing, I'm doing something, but actually sound's coming along and doing, sound is sort of playing me, is one of the ways that I think about it. I don't know, that was a kind of side answer.
Yeah, you just reflected diffracted the question. Kate, have you thought about this? I mean,
Yeah.
you were in these caves where the waves are bouncing around, and
I mean, I have like very pragmatic, very pragmatic sort of responses to your question, because it just entering that world or entering that space, there are practical considerations, and I think that we were each, and we were collectively feeling responsible for what we were doing and how we were doing, as well as, and I think that kind of does open up a real space for really feeling the haptic experience, and rather than a kind of mediated through thought process experience or something. And I'm going to deflect diffraction to and just say that, you know, like for me in my research and in my kind of thinking, and my thinking about field work and my thinking about field practices, and how important that is for the kind of work that I'm doing in terms of my artistic practice and in my research too, is what Harrod and Barrett both say that about relations preceding identity, which is, I think, a kind of really fundamentally important thing for me, and that we need to take responsibility for and towards the relations that we form part of, as well as the ones we enter, and so that we're not like a separate kind of, and maybe that, yeah, so we're not like a kind of a separate entity. We're all part of a relational, just like your sound waves that pass through and come to us from many different from passing through many different materialities. And it's the same with what we are and our relationships and our responsibilities, and I think that's what I would say. And again, it's not a perfect answer to your question, Fernanda, but
wanted to see if there are questions from the audience. So Emilio has his hand up. Would you like to ask the question directly?
Yeah, sure. So it's I guess it's a comment. I really enjoy that, and both of the research, and it really, I mean, both trembling and sensing the water, I guess, made me think a lot of Michel Serres, but very specifically, I mean, also with water, but specifically related to earthquakes. And I've experienced in Mexico City many earthquakes, and three really strong earthquakes. And it makes a lot of sense when I hear Michel Serres saying that an earthquake is remembered in the body. The body remembers, and so this is this sort of massive trembling, collectively trembling, and I guess it is a sound. It is, as you were describing, Nik, before, is this sort of matter shaking, no? And I think it's very interesting to think about memory in that sense, and how sounds and sensing in the water brings there's these memories from the past that come flashing, like, and get really entangled with the present. And I thought it was very interesting in those terms. Yeah, both of the yeah, and also this is one extra thing about the same thing, but in two of the earthquakes, not in every earthquake it has to be at night, but there's this sort of like meteorological phenomena that they're sort of like flashes, and the people all the time think about those, either they're lights from electrical things, but they're not really. They really are something that happens during the earthquakes, the earthquake. And it's interesting how science, at least as far as I know, they haven't given, a clear explanation to those phenomena. So I think it could be interesting also in terms of the research.
Thanks, Emilio. That is really interesting to me. All of that. Yeah, but especially these phenomena, like you're saying, the light that precedes or the flash that precedes the earthquake. It's very interesting to me that there are these kind of like almost prehensions or something, these things going on that kind of precede the phenomena that we've noticed to this point, or that we've studied, or that we've understood. And that's really interesting. And also, I'm glad you're okay. That you've been in Mexico City during these two large earthquakes, and I think that must have been terrifying at some level. And yeah, it's interesting to think about how these things must definitely kind of remain in the body, the transduction of that energy and that trembling to the body. And I don't know if this makes any sense, but I mean, certainly during the pandemic and how things have been here, it kind of feels like everything has sort of like at some point it kind of trembled and then came to a standstill. And I guess what remains to be seen is, will we remember that? You know what I mean? Will we all be able to remember that, and kind of, will it be able to shift our sensing and thinking and being together? Anyway, that was some rambling answer, but thank you. Thank you, Emilio.
Thank you, Emilio, and thank you, Nick, for that comment, because I didn't thank you for the reference to Michel Serres, and also the notion of the body remembering. And I think that what you're just speaking about there, Nick, is about, also the body remembering these events, or these collective events. And I think that, again, there's they're not so loud as maybe, or they're not so prominent as things that we're usually surrounded with. But I think that memory informing our ideas and our ways that we perceive is really important, is a really important thing. So I just wanted to say thank you for that Michel Serres reference.
I think we have time for one more question, if we have anyone else in the audience that would like to ask anything. Colette? Yeah.
I have too much to say in a short amount of time, but gosh, thank you. This has been extraordinary, the conversation between the two of you, and what Emilio and Flounder also added about the diffraction. I think you're already talking about the diffraction in other terms. I mean, my understanding of diffraction is when you have the ripples from two different waves and where they intersect, and that intersection is a change. So even if you talk about transperception, as you said, that when the sound hits something, it also carries with it the traces of not the semantic or the communicative, but of bodies and of everything else that it's experienced. It's now changed, and it carries those traces along with it. So, and also with what you were talking about, Emilio, I think that diffraction is a wonderful way to talk about all of this. And even being in the caves, Kate, that your body, and a lot of this is your approach to it, that you're trying to exist in with everything else. And so you are also impacted by the water, and on other levels, not only the material level, but the psychological level, you are also impacted by all of these vibrations, all of these movements, all of these awarenesses. So I think of that as kind of a diffractive practice. It's where you overlap with the other phenomenon. So that's brilliant. That's a comment. I also wanted to comment on Nik. I've watched many people's presentations several times, but it struck me that since you are a sound artist, your voice really made an impression because it's so calm and it's metered, and it made me aware, as your discussion with Kate had been, how Nik uses so many sonic metaphors, which helps to communicate the meaning. I felt that your voice, Nik, was a part of the presentation. So I just wanted to notate that. And I'm aware I'm running out of time and I'm talking a lot faster. I had prepared this question for Kate, but I think some of what you're talking about, Nik, may be a part of it. So let me just try to get through the presented point to get to the heart of my observation. Kate had been talking about these thresholds, environmental thresholds between the different zones, literal and liminal zones, between, going from water to these different ecological niches where, different kind of more than humans occupy. But I was wondering that in her going from, if she was also talking about thresholds of consciousness. So if you change from thinking away the way we are constrained, as Yusuf talks about, by our Western cultural practices, that our way of understanding through our thinking and through our practices is very, very limited, that if we, in kind of an initiation, go beyond that, to open ourselves up to something more ancient, a different way of knowing, a different kind of a consciousness, a crossing a threshold as an initiation, is almost a return, I would say, to this almost primal way of knowing, where we can connect and sense in a way that what Kate describes as an ecology of the senses, where the human can be capable of really sensing everything else around us. And I mean, I'm thinking about this as a part of consciousness that has been almost banished because of the constrainment by Western approaches. So my question to Kate had been, if you're thinking of thresholds of consciousness and kind of an initiation of our sort of very limited Western approach, was that something that you were also aware of in your work, and yours too, Nik, going beyond this kind of very narrow approach to opening up to these other kinds of phenomenons and other ways of listening and knowing and sensing? I don't know, I started rambling at the end there, so I don't know if I made any sense.
So
Time now, we can go over a little bit. So
hey, did you want to answer, or did you want me to sort of answer or respond?
Do you have a response, Nik, that you'd like to say to Colin?
Well, maybe a short one. And I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about. So, like, how do we kind of, like, for example, how do we unsettle our kind of colonial perceptual frameworks? And I don't think it's easy, right? I think, you know what I mean? I think they're really, really, really entrenched, right? So I think that, and to think that you can sort of go back to something, or that you can just like jump into, like, let's say, an indigenous sensory frame, like obviously I can't, right? And so I think it's more like, are there practices and techniques for just becoming aware as a start of the way that my perceptual kind of framework has been organized, and there are, for sure, and one of them I've been doing, like I was saying, is following the deep listening practice proposed by Pauline Oliveros, but it's a practice and a technique, and a kind of work play, I guess, you know. But I think there's yeah, I think it's something to sort of look at and be aware of and kind of work with. But I also wouldn't want to kind of pretend that I could suddenly jump into or take on another perceptual framework. But I do think these any sort of dishabituating or kind of stranging of relation between us and environment and us and each other in the way that we relate is probably useful. Anyway, what do you think, Kate?
Yeah, I would echo that. I would echo this stranging, and I think that you know, so I'm really dealing with a place that I go back to and go back to and go back to, so that I know it very well, and it's a place that has a lot of pressures. Like it's very urban. It's really urban. It's really multiple uses, multiple coastal uses, layers and layers and layers of industry, from ancient, like kind of blasted kind of trackways that lead out of the sea, where you know, centuries ago people are pulling their boats. There's creosote was made there, so it's early creosote for preserving nets. And so I think what I'm but in amongst this, in this place with its multiple pressures, I find a way of encountering or being in strangeness. And I think that's where the caves allow me to go, really. And I think the most useful way of describing it, I think, is kind of like, I suppose I see the spaces and caves and cave thresholds as Haraway's term of figuration. So not as metaphor, but as they are a place. They are I make these actual trips, but I also think of it as figuration, and this kind of like you know, these entangled threads of knowledge, practice, and power, but for locally and globally. So and again, Nik, I think it's so useful, just the disrupting of usual modes of perceiving and thinking, and not having any solutions either, not having any answers to that. But yeah, that was waffly as well. Sorry.
Yeah, I think you answered that really quite eloquently. I wasn't referring to try to adopt, you know, indigenous or other kinds of modes that had come from it. I think the idea was that, you know, before all of the layering of culture, that we have within us possibilities for different ways of sensing reality, if you want to call it reality. So it was more like a threshold out of our confinement into something new. So I think it's just different language, but you've answered my question really well. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, I think it's a really key question, and sort of where are those thresholds, and where things start to shimmer or tremble. And yeah, I think we're both looking for those.
Yeah, thank you, Colette.
But thank you both. I mean, this conversation was just, I can't tell you how excited, and, you know, my body trembling and vibrating from all this wonderful information, as well as when I was experiencing both of your presentations multiple times. So thank you.